More violence today in Egypt after pro-Morsi supporters rallied for a day of rage. Defenders of the ousted president say that at least 45 people have been killed during clashes with government forces in Cairo. This comes after violence earlier in the week pushed the three-day death toll past 600. The latest clashes come after a pro-Morsi group known as the Anti-Coup Campaign called on supporters to protest peacefully in all of Egypt's revolutionary squares and announced the struggle to overthrow this illegitimate regime is an obligation, an Islamic, national, moral, and human obligation. Joining me today, special correspondent for the Daily Beast, Michael Tomasky, who is also the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, host of MSNBC's Disrupt, Karen Finney, and senior congressional reporter for Talking Points Memo, Sahil Kapoor. And joining us now from Cairo is NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohideen. Ayman, what has happened this week is extraordinary. We were talking before the show about how dramatically this situation has changed since Morsi was first ousted from power. If you look back at those scenes from earlier in July, there were laser lights, there was a sense of jubilation in the square. Couple that with images of today and this week, the violence, 600 people dead. Give us, if you will, the latest, the feeling on the ground in terms of the movement, the the seeming groundswell of support for ousted President Mohamed Morsi.
Well, you know, if there's one way we can describe Egypt over the course of the last several weeks and the last several years, rather, it's every time there's a moment of opportunity, it seems to be squandered. Even if there was any silver lining in the removal of President Mohamed Morsi, as many people here had hoped for, that seems to be dissipating by the day. And today, once again, reaffirms that because we are getting initial reports of a spike in the death toll. Now, we've already been reporting about how violent this week has been. Today was a day that many people were hoping wouldn't be violent. Unfortunately, it is turning out to be just as deadly as some of those in recent memory. According to members of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Anti-Coup Coalition, already alone in Rumsi Square, this was the main square, this was the area that they had called on all their supporters to try and converge to. Already we're getting reports that at least 45 people have been killed. The Ministry of Health officially says 27, but we are expecting that number to rise. Now, this is only in one part of Cairo. In other cities across the country, we are also getting of other reports of fatalities, so that number is expected to rise. Cairo is very much a city on lockdown. Ahead of today's Day of Rage protests that were organized by the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters, the military had deployed in large numbers in various parts of the city to try and shut down some of those major roads. And throughout the protests, we've seen civilians dressed in plain clothes but wielding weapons and essentially terrorizing some of the areas that they were walking through. So there's no right or wrong among both of these sides. That's what is making it so complicated, and that's why it has alienated so many people, despite which side of the divide you're on, and making it extremely volatile overall, Alex.
Ayman, what's the situation in the rest of the country? Because we know the Anti-Coup Campaign is calling for protests across the country in all of Egypt's revolutionary squares. Is the movement growing in other parts of the country outside of Cairo?
Well, you know, the way that we often describe it is they're supporters and sympathizers with the Anti-Coup Coalition. I think that's one of the ways to keep it in mind. The actual members of the Muslim Brotherhood who make up the bulk of that organization and the Muslim Brotherhood, they themselves definitely number in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, across the entire country. But the overwhelming majority of the people in Egypt at this stage have grown disenfranchised with the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not happy with them. They weren't happy with the way they ruled. And that has a lot to do with the president during his time in office. But aside from that, there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to the kind of violence that is now being exacted on the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. People are very critical of this disproportionate use of force by the military and the security forces, despite the fact that they completely reject the Muslim Brotherhood or reject President Mohamed Morsi. And that is why the country is extremely polarized between those who support the Muslim Brotherhood and the Anti-Coup Coalition and those who, on the other hand, supported the removal of President Morsi, but they're not yet ready to commit to supporting the Egyptian military and the security forces in the way they are handling this situation. Not only the individual citizens, but some of the country's leading politicians as well, and that's what led some of them to resign.
Eamon, I'm going to open this up to our panel here in New York. And Karen, seeing what's going on in Egypt, the death toll, 600 people killed this week. There is growing frustration in the United States about what's happening in Egypt. And I want to read an excerpt from Eugene Robinson's op-ed today in the Washington Post, which is highly critical of the president. He says, there may be little the U.S. can do to end the savage bloodletting in Egypt, but at least our nation can be loyal to its ideals by bearing witness and telling the truth. In this, President Obama has failed. A day after Egypt's military-backed interim government slaughtered hundreds of protesters and assumed sweeping emergency powers, Obama still could not bring himself to call what is happening a coup d'etat. Speaking from Martha's Vineyard, he described it as an intervention. What do you make of that?
Well, and particularly, some of the other analysts have suggested that, and we think we saw this when McCain and Lindsey Graham were there, the military basically said the money is no longer a piece of leverage, right? So for a while, that was kind of the explanation we were getting out of the administration, that, the money we give to the military, that's our leverage. That's not even a leverage point at this point. So I think to Gene's point, there's not a good reason why we couldn't have come forward and taking a stronger stand, because if the thing that we thought was going to be our leverage point is now gone, then we don't have that. So we need to either find a different leverage point, but certainly figure out a better way to stand on the side of the people.
Or stand for our ideals, right?
Yes.
Eamon, before we let you go, I want to ask, we talk every day about the role of the United States in all of this, and there are now sort of renewed calls for U.S. to end its military aid to Egypt. That's $1.3 billion in military assistance. Yesterday, the president announced the end or postponing or cancellation of some planned joint military exercises. And I asked you the effect of that in Egypt, and your response was it's basically a so what here in Egypt. Would the cutting off of American military assistance have an effect on the Egyptian government in terms of what's going on, the violence that it's perpetrating on citizens of Egypt right now?
Well, that's somewhat difficult to answer for a few reasons. One, the majority of U.S. aid goes to the Egyptian military. Very little of it actually goes to civil society or to the Egyptian government at large. So it's a more military-to-military relationship in terms of the training of the officer corps, the equipment that's used by the Egyptian military. In recent weeks, since this removal of President Mohammed Morsi, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have given Egypt, or have pledged to give Egypt, billions of dollars, more than the U.S. has given almost tenfold. So there is no shortage of money that would come to support the interim government if, in fact, it needed to. The question really has to do more with that money and the leverage. And right now, the United States is perhaps, the relationship between the United States and Egypt is at an all-time low. Yesterday, the Egyptian presidency issued a statement effectively saying that President Obama's comments yesterday were aiding terrorists, or was leading to the type of violence that would ultimately lead to terrorism. The tone that's coming out of the Egyptian government is that this is an internal Egyptian matter, that Egypt has complete sovereignty over its domestic issues. It knows its country better than anyone else, and it will push ahead with what it needs to do, regardless of what any country tells it, and especially if it's the United States, which traditionally and historically had tremendous amount of leverage over the previous regime of President Hosni Mubarak.
Well, in that way, you sort of have weird symmetry with the president saying Egypt is in the hands of the Egyptians and the Egyptians saying Egypt is in the hands of the Egyptian, although I think each side is interpreting that slightly differently. NBC's Eamon Mohadeen in Cairo, thank you as always, my friend.